All right, before I spend a bunch of time machining over $100 worth of aluminum, let's just do a quick mock-up and make sure all this is gonna fit, that we're not gonna have any issues with distributor clearance or things like that. Greetings, fellow DIYer, and welcome to my video. Of course, this won't be exactly perfect because the heads aren't there to locate the intake, but I think we can get it pretty close. Now here we have a Duraspark distributor, and as you can see, the cap on this is obnoxious. And if I were to stab this in here, we're gonna have clearance issues. I've got a throttle position sensor that's gonna live right here. I've got the aluminum adapters. Could this be made to work? Probably. Is it gonna be easier if I go with something else? Definitely. That something else is an MSD low profile distributor designed to work with Holley's high ram system. And that'll pop right down in there. Now, a couple of things. There's ever so slightly an interference between this intake and this distributor. It's so close that once this gets set on the engine, located by the heads, it may not be an issue. Of course, if the tolerance goes the other direction, it will be an issue. So I may have to just ever so slightly clearance this intake so that we're not making contact. But I really don't think that that is going to be an issue. Here's the 1¼ inch base plate. That's gonna go on here. And with it all the way forward, we still have room to easily get our spark plug boots on this distributor cap. Then we get the second piece on, still everything looks good. And finally, we'll add our TBIs that have been converted into throttle bodies. And as you can see, everything clears. Now, obviously this is gonna have to be notched for this throttle linkage arm, and that's not gonna be an issue at all. The plenum space is well over for this top piece, so we can easily clearance that for this arm. And that to me looks like everything's gonna clear. I have plenty of room to get the spark plug boots on this distributor cap. I have plenty of room between the throttle position sensor and the distributor. I think this is gonna work extremely well, and now we can get to machining this aluminum. I figured out exactly how I want to do it to match this top piece to this bottom piece. And we're going to take this to the bench and we're going to get some lines drawn in and get this intake project actually started. Now that we know that I can fit these components onto the block and onto the intake, we have to figure out exactly how to match this to that. And we're gonna set this on top. I've actually got this locked so that it's upright. There's some clearance issues between this throttle linkage and this section of the gasket, but I can totally deal with that on my DIY intake. All right, right there is pretty much centered. We're not perfectly centered. Like, if you look at the distance between this butterfly and this butterfly, this is not exactly centered, but it's pretty close. And we should have good feeding into all 4 intake ports, as well as the fact that we'll have this open plenum that is going to be roughly the shape of these 8 ports, so that we do get some balance and some sharing between these 2 sides. Looks to me like I have room for a bolt here, 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 and here. So that is how we're going to locate everything. We're going to transfer this pattern to the bottom piece of aluminum and trace it out and drill all 6 holes. Then we're going to use the freshly drilled piece of aluminum to locate these 4 holes onto the top plate. And from there, we can draw this opening in and begin to lay out exactly where everything is going to go. The only other potential issue that we're going to have is these 4 mounting studs on the top plate. The holes for those studs are going to go into the plenum. And I really have no choice but to have that be the case. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to use thread sealant and carburetor studs in those 4 locations so that it goes into the open plenum, is sealed so it's not a vacuum leak, and then from there allows us to bolt down these 2 throttle bodies. It's kind of hard to see on camera, but I have actually scribed 2 lines that are there so that I can line this gasket up and get it properly positioned. And that's pretty close. Now I have this set up so that the bottom of this gasket is currently the top because that's how this piece is going to fit on the intake. But the nice thing is with this piece, until I machine in the little bit of plenum that I'm going to add, the top and bottom are actually interchangeable. And just like that, we've got the pattern on there and we can actually begin some machining. If you're only going to take away one thing from this video, let it be this. ATF makes outstanding cutting fluid when cutting aluminum. Every single aspect of this, from the lid to the base, is based on these 6 holes. That is what will align plenums. It is what will align this top to this bottom. It's what aligns everything to the truck intake that it's all being bolted to. Now, for the case of the top, we need to transfer these 4 holes. These 2 are not going to get transferred. As I showed you before, there was clearance issues with the throttle linkage. And transferring this is really going to be pretty simple. I'm going to stack this on top of this. I am going to line everything up. And then we're just simply going to clamp it on this end. And that will allow me to drill out these 4 holes and have it be a perfect match. Now with the holes in there, I can line up the gasket, transfer the drawing to the top, and have this roughly where it needs to be. Now, there's going to need to be some fine-tuning and some adjustment, and drill bits could have wandered and that sort of thing. And that's perfectly fine. All I'm after right now is just a rough shape so that I can do the rough machining, and then I will go back in and fine-tune things when the time comes. That's also part of why I started each hole with just 1/4 inch. Actually, that looks a little smaller than 1/4 inch, so that I have room to adjust them as need be. All right, everything's been laid out. I've got all my markings, and everything has been stacked in the way it will be when it is finished. Now, obviously, I'm not going to drill through these 8 holes in the top. This was just to get an overall idea of how it all fits together. Again, we're locating with these 4 screws. We have the top lid. We have the bottom of the lid. Same thing. We've got the gasket drawn out, and then we have the top of the base. So the next step is going to be to start machining. I think I'm going to start with the lid and cut in the plenum. And then once I have that done, we're going to individually cut in these 8 holes. The plenum in the lid is done. It still needs to be smoothed and rounded out, but the roughing has been done. I'm just going to show the finished product. But before I do that, I want to tell you that if you don't have a mill, you can still do this. I have a video where I made an adapter that goes between a Ford 5.0 fuel injection upper and a 5.8 fuel injection lower, this pattern right here. And I did the whole thing without using the mill. I did it by drilling out the holes and then using a die grinder to smooth things out. And that would totally be an option in this case. All right, here's the great unveil, the top part of the plenum. So my mill is altogether too small for this project. You can see that line right there. That is because I had no choice but to mill out 1/2 and then flip this piece around and do the other half. Not only do I not have quite that much travel on the mill, I also ran into an issue of this being a fairly large piece and being a challenge to clamp. I was able to clamp it on 2 sides, which seemed to hold it pretty well. Thankfully, it's soft aluminum. And then once I got one side done and to the depth that I wanted, I flipped the aluminum around and reclamped it and then did the other side. I'm very pleased with how that came out. Now I need to stick this in the mill and do the same thing. Ultimately, I'm going for about 3/4 of an inch to a full inch of plenum. I haven't decided exactly. Took me a couple hours to mill this out, and I imagine I've got quite a bit of time ahead of me in milling this out. But we are definitely getting closer. Now that I have the first part of the plenum milled out, the next piece would be to punch the holes in here and here for the butterflies of the throttle bodies. This is where things get a little more challenging. For the sake of illustration, we're going to look at it on here rather than here. What I want is, I want this to be as close to centered in each individual bank of 4. Problem is, I had distance constraints here, and it doesn't work exactly to be centered. So ultimately, I need these 2 sets of holes to be properly spaced to match these 2 throttle bodies, and then I need them centered between this edge and this edge. Now, a person can spend a lot of time doing a lot of calculations and plotting, and you could use layout fluid, and there's all kinds of things you could do to transfer these holes to this piece of aluminum. My solution is relatively simple. All I'm going to do is take a piece of paper and create a template that has the specs for both of these gaskets as one solid piece. That allows me to flip this over, set it on there, mark everything. But it also allows me to double check and make sure that everything is correct on the underside of this before I transfer anything to this. Now if I cut this out all as one piece, I should be able to put it on the bottom of the throttle bodies and see if I've got it laid out correctly. All right, let's see if this harebrained idea to make a template actually is going to work. That looks perfect. Now I can use this to transfer the pattern onto the lid. So here's the layout. The black lines are the Ford 5.8 lower pattern, and the blue lines are now my new pattern for these throttle bodies. And if the throttle bodies were perfectly centered on each bank of 4, everything would be shifted in together just a little bit. but it is off ever so slightly. The fact that we've got it on both sides and it's centered from here to here should give me the balance I need, especially with the open plenum. So all I need to do now is drill the 6 mounting holes and mill out the 3 holes for the butterflies. The process for putting these holes in this lid was really pretty simple. All I did was drilled a hole in the center of each circle that I had marked out. Then I put the piece of aluminum in the mill and used an end mill to rough out the general shape of each of the 4 ports. From there, I used a boring head and boring bar to true up the holes and to correctly position them. I took careful measurements and used my DRO to know exactly where the center line was for each hole and get it correctly positioned. Here we have the top plate with the majority of the machining done. Now, there's definitely some aesthetics. I'm going to trim off some of this and actually make it look decent instead of being this big obnoxious block. But the functional machining is basically done. We have the 4 holes for the butterflies. We have clearance for the throttle linkage. I have the 2 mounting holes here. Now I am going to put 2 mounting holes here to bolt this into the lower chunk of aluminum because I had clearance issues and couldn't put them here. So this is where I notched it out for the last 2 bolts that are going to hold down the bottom section. If we flip it over, again, we've got our 4 bolts, 2 clearance sections. I've got this nice open plenum. Now you can see a blue line here and a blue line here. I actually left a little material in there and you can see a step there and a step there. Once I get the bottom piece machined, I'm actually going to come up through that and blend the top of the bottom piece into this. So we have a nice rounded edge and a nice smooth transition. So I left that there on purpose. All I have to do to this now is tap 6 holes and install carb studs. And I'm going to show you how to do that. Wait a minute. You're probably thinking, there's a lot of machining that happened here that I didn't show on camera. And now you're going to show me how to tap a hole? Yeah, that sounds about right. I've said over and over again on my channel, I am not a machinist. I am a fabricator. These holes probably aren't perfectly centered this way, or they might be off a little bit this way. But for the stuff I'm doing, being off a little bit is not the end of the world. I have quite a few fabrication skills, and I'm gaining machining skills, but I am a self-taught machinist. I mean, don't get me wrong, I've, like the rest of you, spent time on YouTube and learned things from some fantastic machining channels out there, which is exactly why I'm not showing you any of my machining, because there are far better machinist channels out there that are going to show you the right way to do it, instead of me showing you how I did it, which may be right or just as easily may be wrong. So back to tapping. Why in the world would I show you how to tap a hole? Well, it's because of a little invention I have right there. I call that a square tap. Now, at first, that might imply that you're somehow making a square hole, but you're not. You're making a round hole. The square aspect is getting this tap perpendicular to the hole that we are threading. And to make a square tap, all you have to do is take a piece of steel, weld a nut of the correct size and thread onto it, and now you have a guide. Something that will allow you to make the hole perfectly perpendicular to the surface. It allows you to start those threads. Here I'm tapping aluminum, and we all know how hard aluminum can be to get it started. Like as you're starting to spin it down, it strips out. So by using a tool like this, it makes it super simple to get a perfect thread every time. So how do we use this? Well, I take and thread the tap so that it's sticking through, and then I put it down on my hole, and while holding it down, I tighten it down by hand until it grabs. And what that does is that centers this in the hole. How about if we use a clamp that's a little more reasonably sized for this? Once I have that properly in place, I can put my clamp on there and clamp it down. And we are now set up to tap this hole. Now again, as I said earlier, ATF is a fantastic cutting fluid when working with aluminum. So I'm just going to dip my tap in the ATF, and we're just going to start the tapping process. And again, I am not stripping out the aluminum as I'm tapping it. I'm just cutting nice threads. I don't have to worry about the tap being properly aligned, so that means my studs are going to be nice and vertical, and the final result is a hole that is tapped exactly the way you want it. Now you would think aluminum being so soft that it would be super easy to tap, but in some ways it's harder than steel because it kind of tends to gall up. So cutting fluid is not optional, in my opinion, when tapping holes in aluminum. Take our carb stud, screw it down in there. One stud down, 5 to go. So here's the moment of truth. Let's see if a fabricator teaching himself how to do machining machined this accurately enough for this to fit and function. Start with the gasket. Snug fit, but it's going on. We are set. Now, time for the throttle bodies. There's going to need to be some clearancing done to this bottom piece to clear the throttle linkage, or I'm going to have to modify the throttle linkage. So I won't be able to install this onto this with this sitting in the proper position on this. But if we take and slide this over, for the time being, the clearance is taken care of. All right, we'll take and drop this down on. Oh, that was smooth. Went right on. I'm only going to put on 2 nuts because I've only got to have enough to hold it to show that it works. Well, that all looks pretty good. Now if we move the throttle linkage, look at that. That opens just the way it is supposed to. I am very happy with how that all came together. Now my plan for this video was to do the machining for both pieces of aluminum and show you all of that. But this video is already getting way too long. Now there are some YouTubers that can do a 30 or 45 minute video, but frankly, I'm not that entertaining. So we're going to call this a day for this project. And when we get to this bottom section, that will be another video in and of itself. Now, before I go, I'm going to leave you with one more thought. I machined this top plate so that I have something to match this to. And I'm actually going to mount this up onto the EFFI 5.8 lower and directly match the ovals in that intake to the bottom of this. Basically, by doing the top first and then matching this to the bottom, I can then blend this into this so that we have a smooth transition. That may be my next video on YouTube, or I may be working on something else. Either way, it won't be that long and we will get into the video on this bottom section. And once we get done with this Frankenstein EFFI will be done. Oh, that looks good. Not to toot my own horn, but man, that looks good.
If you like what you've seen, please click like. If you'd like to see more, please subscribe. Thanks for watching.